911, what's your emergency?
It begins with a test. A simple swab, a harmless collection of DNA. For most, it's a tool to connect with ancestors, a chance to uncover roots long forgotten, to celebrate heritage. But sometimes that search for truth uncovers something far darker. A secret that changes everything. For one man, it didn't just change his life, it destroyed it. Don't forget that every second counts when unraveling mysteries and uncovering the truth. If you're truly passionate about real-time crime stories and want to stay ahead of the curve, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join the Real-Time Crime 911 community today. Thank you. He was a cop, a man who wore his badge with pride, a protector of his community, a devoted husband, a loving father to 2 children who were his entire world. His life seemed ordinary, perhaps even enviable. But what he uncovered would rip that life apart and expose a betrayal so profound it led to murder. The results came back and they were conclusive. The children he thought were his, the children he held as newborns, watched grow and tucked in at night, were not his own. That revelation alone might have been bearable, but the real shock was yet to come. Their true father was not a stranger, it was his brother. In that moment, everything he knew, everything he believed came crashing down. Betrayal. It's a word often overused, often misunderstood. But how do you define betrayal when it comes from the person you trusted most in the world? When the very foundation of your family crumbles beneath you, what is left? They were brothers. Blood bound them, loyalty defined them. The bond they shared now revealed itself as a lie. A lie that had been living within his own home, under his own roof. A betrayal hidden in plain sight, wrapped in the laughter of children who called him Dad. He could have walked away. He could have turned his back on them, started over, tried to rebuild. But betrayal isn't just a wound, it's a poison. And in his case, it began to fester, to spread, to consume him from within. This is not just a story of infidelity or family secrets. It is a story of vengeance, of a man who sought to reclaim control over a life torn apart. It is a story that begins with a simple DNA test and ends in bloodshed. 2 lives were lost, and a family was left in ruins. What would you do if the person you trusted most took everything from you? How far would you go for revenge? And when does justice become something far more dangerous? It was a quiet, unassuming morning in Brooklyn, the kind of place where fences are white, lawns are manicured, and the sound of children playing fills the air. But on this day, there was no laughter, no signs of life from the house on the corner. It stood still and silent, an ominous contrast to the bustling world around it. Something wasn't right. The call came into dispatch just after 7 a.m. A neighbor had reported something unusual, a noise in the middle of the night, shouting, loud enough to wake her from a deep sleep. She thought it might have been a domestic argument, but when she looked outside, the house was dark. No lights, no movement. Hours later, the smell began to seep through the air. Subtle at first, but undeniable. She knew then it wasn't just an argument, it was something far worse. When officers arrived, the scene was deceptively normal at first glance. The lawn was untouched, the driveway empty. But as they approached the front door, they noticed the smallest detail. A streak of red on the doorknob. A smudge, faint, almost unnoticeable in the early light. And then, as they stepped closer, the unmistakable metallic scent hit them. Blood. Inside, the house was a different world entirely. The once pristine living room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor. The faint outline of a struggle was etched into every corner. And then, in the hallway, they found the bodies. 2 victims, lifeless and cold. A man face down, his head resting in a pool of blood that had long since congealed. Beside him, a woman crumpled against the wall, her hands frozen in a defensive posture, as if trying to shield herself from an attacker. The violence was undeniable. Whoever had done this wasn't just angry. They were unhinged. The officers moved methodically, their training guiding them through the grim tableau. Blood spatter on the walls told a story of rage and chaos, of blows delivered with unrelenting force. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a stark reminder of life's mundanity juxtaposed against death's finality. As the crime scene team began their work, neighbors gathered outside, whispering in hushed tones, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. Who could have done this? What could have led to such a brutal scene in a house that had always seemed so ordinary? Detectives soon arrived, their presence commanding, their expressions grim. They began piecing together the timeline, asking questions, looking for answers in the chaos. The victims were identified quickly. A man and a woman, both in their late 30s, their identities confirmed by the scattered IDs found near the kitchen counter. But the connection to the house's owner, a respected police officer, was where things took a turn. As they searched for leads, a name kept surfacing in whispers. The owner of the house, the cop. A man known for his service, his dedication to the law and his love for his family. But he was missing. Where was he? And what did he know about the horror that had unfolded in his home? But as the hours passed, as his story unfolded, the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. It was personal. And at the center of it all was a revelation so shocking, it left even the most seasoned detectives speechless. A simple DNA test. A test meant to uncover heritage, to trace family roots. But instead, it revealed a betrayal so profound, it led to this. A double murder, a family destroyed, and a man pushed to his absolute breaking point. Before the chaos, before the bloodshed and betrayal, there was Daniel Carter, just another cop in Brooklyn. But to those who knew him, he was a devoted father and a loyal brother. His life seemed perfectly ordinary, built on the kind of routine many envy. Work during the day, family at night. He was a man who cherished the simple joys of fatherhood. His kids, Lily and Sam, were his world. They were young, full of life, and to Daniel, everything in his life had led him to them. His son's infectious laughter echoed through the house, and his daughter's constant questions about the world around her made him smile, even on the toughest days. Daniel's relationship with his brother Jake was one of unspoken understanding. They'd grown up together, been through their share of childhood scrapes, and had always shared a mutual respect. Jake was the wild card, never quite as settled as Daniel, but their bond was undeniable. Over the years, Jake had become a regular presence in Daniel's home, spending weekends with him, his wife, and the kids. Family barbecues and late-night talks became their ritual, their moments of connection. But somewhere in the background of this perfect family life, there was something that Daniel couldn't ignore. He didn't want to think about it, but the whispers were there. Quiet, subtle, but persistent. And it all began with a passing comment from his close friend Mark, a fellow officer. "You ever notice how much Lily looks like Jake?" Mark had said casually, his voice light, but the words stuck with Daniel like a thorn in his side. At first, Daniel laughed it off. Of course, his daughter resembled his brother. Families often had similarities. But then it lingered in his thoughts, growing louder with each passing day. A quick glance at his daughter one evening, the way she tilted her head when she thought about something, an identical gesture Jake made. It was an eerie feeling, a cold shiver running down his spine. Then there was Sam, his son. A sharp resemblance too, more than just coincidence. Daniel found himself watching his kids, noticing things he hadn't before. Traits they shared with Jake, mannerisms, little quirks. The longer he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Could it be true? Could his own brother have fathered his children? The question gnawed at him and he couldn't shake it. It wasn't suspicion. No, it was curiosity. And it wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about the man his brother was, about the secrets he was keeping, and about the life they had shared together. One night, after the thought had consumed him for weeks, Daniel made a decision. He'd seen the ads for DNA testing kits before, promises of family discovery, of heritage tracing, and genetic connections. He ordered one. It wasn't about finding out some long-lost ancestor. It was about finding the truth. The kit arrived quickly, and Daniel took the swab without hesitation. He sealed the sample, packaged it up, and sent it off. He told his wife, Rachel, about it over dinner, trying to keep the mood light. He joked about tracing their family history, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was looking for something. He needed to know. As the weeks passed, the anticipation became unbearable. Daniel found himself checking his email every morning, every night, hoping for the results. He tried to distract himself, work, family life, but every moment was punctuated with the thought, what if it's true? Then, late one evening, after coming back from a long shift, Daniel opened the email. The DNA results had arrived. He stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of him. His breath caught in his throat as the information sank in. The report was clear. The children he had loved as his own weren't his biological children. His son, Sam. His daughter, Lily. The truth hit him like a freight train, crashing into him with an intensity that stole the air from his lungs. He sat frozen in front of the screen, trying to understand what he was seeing. This was a mistake, he thought. There had to be a mistake. But no. There it was, staring back at him. Jake, his brother. The man who had always been there, who had laughed with him, shared stories, supported him through thick and thin. Jake was their father. The revelation was simple, cold, and utterly shattering. Daniel's hands trembled as he looked at the report. His entire life had just been flipped upside down. The foundation he had built his entire world on, his family, his pride, was now a lie. His mind raced, flashing through years of memories. The way Jake had looked at Lily, the quiet smiles between them, the way they had shared moments no one else understood. How had he missed it? How had he not seen it? His gaze fell on the report, now discarded on the floor beside him. The paper was still warm from his touch, the weight of the words unbearable. It was a betrayal so complete, so devastating, that it left him unable to move. What had been his life, his happiness, was now shattered. His brother had stolen everything, his children, his trust, his sense of self. The betrayal was so profound it was beyond comprehension. His brother had fathered his children. And now, Daniel's world had come crashing down. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. The truth was more than just a shock. It was a weapon, one that was tearing him apart from the inside out. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only feel the deep, consuming pain of betrayal. And in that moment, everything he had known, everything he had loved, no longer existed. The weight of the truth bore down on Daniel with an intensity he couldn't have prepared for. At first, there was disbelief. He could barely look at the faces of his children without feeling the crushing realization of what had been taken from him. Sam and Lily, his son and daughter, no longer felt like his. The eyes he once saw as his own now belonged to his brother, Jake. Every laugh, every kiss, every bedtime story became a reminder of the unbearable lie. Daniel spent the following days in a fog, numb to the world around him. His work as a cop didn't matter anymore. The endless hours of paperwork, the traffic stops, the arrests, it all felt meaningless in the wake of his personal devastation. He would come home and sit for hours staring at the walls, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had happened. Rachel, his wife, tried to reach him. But how do you console a man who has lost his entire sense of identity? She watched him pull further away, retreating into a shell of anger and hurt. They hadn't spoken much about it yet, and he wasn't ready. He didn't want to talk about Jake. Not yet. He didn't want to discuss how his brother had betrayed him in the worst possible way. There was a coldness between them now, a silence that spoke volumes. His relationship with Jake, once built on years of shared experiences, felt irreparable. Daniel couldn't bear to face his brother. Every time he tried, memories flooded back. Jake teaching him how to ride a bike, the countless hours they'd spent together as kids, the trust they'd built, the promises they'd made. But now, Jake wasn't his brother anymore. He was the man who had stolen his family, the man who had destroyed everything he'd worked for. Every interaction with his brother now felt suffocating. At family gatherings, Jake's presence was a looming reminder of the dark secret they shared. Daniel would find himself watching Jake from across the room, noticing the way Jake would look at the kids, almost protectively, as though he knew something Daniel didn't. It made Daniel sick. One evening, after yet another awkward dinner where they barely spoke, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. The pressure of the secret, the betrayal, and the anger that had been building inside him reached a boiling point. He needed to confront Jake. He needed to hear it from his own lips. Daniel waited until the night had fallen, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. He called Jake, his voice cold, clipped. "Meet me at the old cabin," Daniel said, his words heavy with intent. "We need to talk." Jake agreed, the tension in his voice unmistakable. He didn't ask questions. He knew deep down what was coming. Jake was already there, standing outside, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He looked nervous, his eyes shifting as Daniel approached. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on his face, making him look older than Daniel remembered. Daniel didn't say a word as he walked up to Jake. His anger burned in his chest, but he was still trying to contain it. He was holding on by a thread. "So, what's this about, Daniel?" Jake's voice trembled, betraying his calm facade. "Don't play dumb," Daniel snapped, his voice tight. "You know why we're here." Jake swallowed hard. "Look, man, No," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "I want to hear it from you. I want to hear you tell me how you could do this, how you could take my children, my life, and turn it into a lie." Jake's face twisted, a flash of guilt crossing his features before he quickly masked it with defensiveness. "I never meant for it to happen this way, I swear, Daniel, "Shut up!" Daniel shouted, stepping closer to his brother. "You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to tell me that you didn't know what you were doing. I trusted you, I loved you, and you destroyed everything. You destroyed my family." Jake's eyes flickered with something close to shame, but it was gone too quickly. "I never meant for it to go this far, but it did. You don't understand, Daniel, it was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you, but—" "A mistake?" Daniel growled, stepping forward until he was nose to nose with Jake. "How long has it been going on, Jake? How many years? How long were you sleeping with Rachel behind my back?" Jake stood silent for a moment, the weight of the confrontation bearing down on him. And then something changed. A flicker of anger, of rage, flashed in Jake's eyes. He stepped back, his fists clenching at his sides. "Then maybe you're not the man I thought you were either." The words were a slap in the face, a challenge Daniel didn't expect. His chest tightened, his blood boiling. What had started as a conversation quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. The night had fallen heavy, cloaking the small cabin in an eerie silence. Daniel paced restlessly in his dimly lit living room, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. He could still hear the echo of his brother's laughter in his mind, the sound that had once been a symbol of family, of shared memories, but now was nothing more than an irritating reminder of the betrayal that had poisoned his world. The anger simmered in him, a quiet storm just beneath the surface. Tonight was the night everything would change. Inside the cabin, Jake and Rachel were unaware of the storm that was about to break upon them. They had been spending the evening quietly, talking, perhaps reflecting on their own lives. Rachel, sitting on the couch, had no inkling that this was the last night she would ever see. Jake, too, was unaware of the danger lurking at the doorstep, still reeling from the discovery of his brother's betrayal, but choosing to push those feelings aside for a few hours of peace. When the door slammed open, they both turned in shock, instinctively standing up. Daniel was there, his face twisted with emotion, a fury in his eyes that neither of them could fully comprehend. Jake stepped forward, trying to assess the situation, his voice tense as he demanded to know what Daniel was doing there at this hour. His words were calm, but the tension in the room was thick, palpable. "Why are you here, Daniel?" Jake's voice was strained, but it wasn't the voice of a man who knew the storm that was about to hit. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, pushing his brother back with force. The rage that had been boiling inside him for so long could no longer be contained. Every moment of hurt, every ounce of betrayal, every second of disbelief was released in a violent eruption. Jake stumbled back, hands held up in confusion. "What the hell are you doing? What's going on?" But Daniel wasn't listening. The brother he had once trusted, the man who had stolen everything from him, stood before him now as nothing more than an enemy. His emotions spiraled out of control, and in the chaos he grabbed the nearest object, a wrench, cold and heavy, lying on a table in the corner of the room. The first blow was unexpected. A sickening thud echoed through the room as the wrench struck Jake's skull. He crumpled instantly, his body collapsing to the ground, eyes wide in shock. Rachel screamed, rushing to his side, but Daniel was already upon her, his rage too powerful to stop. She didn't have a chance. His hands were around her throat, and in that moment the cabin transformed into a scene of brutal violence, a place of life and love that had turned into a cold, merciless grave. When the dust settled, the room was still. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards as Daniel stepped back, his chest heaving with the aftermath of his actions. In the darkness of the night, it felt as though time had stopped, and nothing in the world could ever undo the damage he had done. By the time the police arrived at the cabin, hours had passed. The crime scene was a gruesome tableau, the aftermath of a momentary but catastrophic breakdown of everything Daniel had known. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together the events of that night. They found the bodies of Jake and Rachel lying in the living room, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The blood had already started to dry, staining the carpet in dark pools that would never be cleaned, never be forgotten. As the investigation unfolded, police began to unravel the twisted truth behind the murders. Interviews with family members painted a picture of a man whose mind had been slowly deteriorating under the weight of secrets. Daniel had been keeping to himself, distancing himself from everyone, and yet no one had seen it coming. No one had known that his anger would finally explode in such an unforgivable way. No one had realized that the DNA test would be the spark that ignited this tragedy. As the days passed, the search for Daniel continued, but the psychological impact of the crime had already set in. For the police, it wasn't just about finding the murderer. It was about understanding how something so senseless had happened. Interviews with experts painted a picture of a man driven to the edge, someone who had reached a point where nothing mattered anymore. But in the end, all that was left was the carnage, the shattered lives, and a community forever changed by the tragic outcome of a family secret gone horribly wrong. As the investigation into Daniel's actions drew to a close, Brooklyn was left in a stunned silence, trying to make sense of the devastation. A community that had once been bound by shared histories, families, and traditions was now shattered. The families of Jake and Rachel, left to grieve the loss of loved ones taken too soon, struggled to find any sense of peace in the wake of the double murder. The question of how something so horrific could have been prevented lingered in the minds of everyone who knew the brothers. Daniel, once a proud and respected member of the force, now faced the consequences of a violent outburst that not only destroyed his own life, but took 2 others in the process. His betrayal of family, his breakdown under pressure, and his inability to control the devastating rage that had consumed him ultimately led to the brutal loss of 2 lives. The psychological toll of his discovery, the revelation that his own brother had fathered his children, had been far greater than anyone could have anticipated. But it raised an unanswerable question. Could it have been avoided? The emotional and psychological complexity of the case was hard to ignore. It wasn't just a story of one man snapping and committing murder. This was about the unraveling of a family, a house of cards built on lies and betrayal, all of it eventually collapsing under the weight of a single truth. Daniel had been a man defined by his role as a father, his pride in raising his children, only to be confronted with the horror that his entire life had been built on a lie. His brother, Jake, was not only responsible for the affair but had stolen the life Daniel believed was his, planting seeds of rage in a relationship that should have been built on trust. In many ways, this case reflected the darker side of human nature, the complexities of betrayal, the lengths one would go to in the name of justice, and the devastating consequences that follow when love and trust turn into vengeance. The tragedy forced everyone involved to question their own understanding of right and wrong. Was Daniel justified in feeling betrayed? Could his actions have been excused, given the emotional devastation he had endured? Or was this a tragedy that could have been prevented, if only there had been a moment to step back, to allow reason to overcome emotion? As the police continued to investigate the final moments leading up to the murders, it became clear that the lines between vengeance and justice had become irreparably blurred. Daniel had crossed a line that could never be undone. The emotional scars would forever remain, not just for him, but for everyone who had been touched by the tragedy. Jake and Rachel's families would never be the same. And Daniel's own life, now in ruins, was a constant reminder of the destructive power of betrayal. The tragedy of the double murder left behind nothing but broken families, destroyed lives, and the haunting memory of a brother's love twisted into hatred. It forced those left behind to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about family, loyalty, and the terrible consequences of what can happen when a secret too dark is kept for far too long. And so we are left with this. When betrayal runs this deep, what would you do? Can anger and hurt ever justify such extreme actions? Could the terrible events that unfolded in that small, quiet cabin have been prevented if the truth had come to light sooner? Or was this a tragedy that could only have ended in bloodshed? The moral complexity of the case remains. There are no easy answers, no clear path to understanding. But it's a story we all must grapple with. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? Could you have found another way? We want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts below. Would you have acted differently? Your comments are more than just feedback. They're a conversation. A chance to reflect on what it means to live with betrayal, to seek justice, and to understand the complexities of the human heart. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.